Welcome once again to our dark discussion. This is number 16 in our exploration of many things criminous. Over here is Ellen Hart, author of the Jane Lawless series, one of my co-hosts. Our other co-host, of course, is William Kent Kruger, author of the Cork O'Connor series. A little later, we'll welcome fellow Minnesota author here in her incarnation as Monica Ferris, and we'll explain that statement too. First, let's talk about some differences and some similarities above and between the hard-boiled mystery and the so-called cozy or traditional crime novel. What do you say to that, Mr. Kruger?
You know, I think for the sake of our viewers, maybe we need to define a few terms here.
Works for me.
Yeah, I'm going to throw this actually to Ellen because she writes an admittedly traditional novel. What do you think of as traditional?
You know, I mean, if I'm going to start talking, I mean, you were talking before the program began about that the cozy and the traditional novel were somewhat different.
You mean this is not live?
Well, we're live, but. And I'd very much like to hear your thoughts on the subject. If I'm going to talk about a traditional mystery, I guess what I would say is that it tends to be, the aesthetic is, how do I put it? It's there's no violence in a cozy. There's
you mean on the page?
Prolonged pain, yes, on the page. Mm-hmm. It's generally told in third person. Mm-hmm. It's generally a female sleuth, very often an amateur sleuth, and. Did I say third person? It tends sometimes to be set in an insular setting, right. And that's beyond that. I think that would cover pretty much everything. But then you were going to suggest that the cozy was different.
Carl, when he introduced it, talked about cozy or traditional. I think that there's a difference in the cozy and the traditional. Oh. I would think that, I would submit that the cozy is a subcategory of traditional. It has all of those elements. Mm-hmm. It's insular. It has no sex and violence. Very often it's a female protagonist, but in addition to those things, I think it exists at the gentlest end of the genre. Yes. And one of the things I think that marks most cozies is that there's a specific niche interest that cozies address that runs through the whole series and in a sense drives the series.
And you're saying that that's not necessarily traditional.
And that's not necessarily true of a traditional mystery. Right. But in the niche you have books that deal with knitting. That's really what drives the series. Or needlepoint or antiquing. And that's what brings the readers to those books is that particular interest. Now, the book satisfies on many other levels as well, but it's that niche interest I think that maybe sets a cozy apart. And even the gentler aspect than the traditional.
Right. I think even within the cozy, you can go from, an edgier cozy to an extremely sweet cozy. I think the universe in a cozy is very benign, and you have some sort of violent action inserted into it, a murder of some sort usually.
All off page.
All off the camera, right? And then essentially, I think when you get to the end of a cozy, you have moved back to, we want everything to be good and we want everything to be
balanced
and serene and people to be happy. And I think it's extremely important in cozies for the main characters to be likable, and that's not the case at all in hard-boiled novels.
So let's talk about hard-boiled.
Well,
or you do want another comment?
I have another comment because my adventure novels, my sailing novels, are by most reviewers are referred to as cozies.
Mm-hmm. I don't think they are.
I don't think they are either. I think they're much darker than a typical cozy. I think there's action, which is generally speaking not what you're going to find in a typical cozy. There's an enormous amount of suspense that depends on visceral threats. Somebody is really going to get hurt.
Another element too, is, there's no bad language in a traditional cozy. In the traditional mystery, and I don't know where soft-boiled comes in here, but I think.
Where would you like it to come?
Well, I think, based on what I read about just the tradition, the cozy, I don't write a cozy either. I mean, there is, if there are characters that demand bad language, I put it in. The victim never endures prolonged suffering in a cozy. They do in my novels.
Let's really quick talk about hard-boiled, because there are some similarities, I think, between the hard-boiled and the traditional that don't necessarily apply to the cozy. Hard-boileds tend to be dark, they tend to be brooding, they tend to be violent, they tend to be sexual. That language that you talk about not appearing in traditional and cozy, you will very often find in large amounts in the hard-boiled end of the genre. So in some ways they're as different as night and day, but there's some similarities between the traditional. I mean, they all revolve around a crime, usually a murder. They all involve the investigation that goes along with the typical mystery. And I think traditionals more and more, and you're really a great example of this, begin to delve more and more into the dark psychological motivations.
Moral issues,
and moral issues.
Yeah.
And that's where hard-boiled really gets so much of its power, because it really goes deeply into those.
You write a dark book, but it's not hard-boiled.
I agree.
Now what's that?
Exactly, that, which is one of the reasons why I wanted us to talk about this a little bit. Your books, not Sweet Poison, which is the most recent, but the one before that, which named The Mortal Groove, deals with has violence on the page.
That's the theme of it.
And its theme is violence.
Yeah.
So one of the differences that's often referred to is that the violence occurs either off the page or not
in that book.
But in your book, that's not true. And the same thing is true in my adventure series. In the Jack Marston series. But you could say that it's traditional or that it's a cozy. That definition of a closed environment. You have a ship with 5-6 people on it, for example, or you have a small town that in which. Well, I was going to say you have a small town, your Aurora, which allows you to deal with a relatively closed environment. But the fact is that a great many of the people are from the outside.
Come from the outside, and the violence comes from the outside.
But your novels are dark. They're suspenseful. There's lots of action.
So they're hard-boiled.
But I think one of the other elements of the hard-boiled is a cynical take on life.
Yes.
That very often is a characteristic. Yeah. And my books certainly don't have that cynical take on life.
Right.
That's true. But isn't that cynical outlook
more
typically
noir.
Focused?
Yeah, here we go. Noir. Another term.
Isn't that typically focused in the detective or the
PI.
The PI or whoever the protagonist is. In your case, Cork O'Connor. But see that, and so you see right away that's not true, because he is nothing if not. He's certainly not a dark figure. I mean, he has some angst. He has some problems.
Sure.
But he's not a cynical. His take on life and on the world is not cynical at all.
It sounds to me like our definitions are lacking. Everything is all mixed up today.
Well, I think Carl is always railing about the fact that the categorizations just don't work, and I think that's exactly what we're saying
They're used
here.
to sell. I mean, although my editor in New York is very, very against any kind of category title, she doesn't read it. She's not really interested.
See, I think that's good, because I know they're used to sell. They're used by bookstores as to where to put the book and all those different kinds of things. I understand all that, but I also understand that you run into a real problem when you say to a potential customer, "This is a traditional mystery," and the customer has, because of all of the things we talk about, in the whole area, it has certain connotations and you get certain expectations, and I think that. We owe it to our readers, and we owe it to the bookstore, to everybody in the community, to try to figure out, not just us, but to try to figure out some way in which those labels can be better, our books can be better identified, because that's obviously going to make more good kind of sales. Well, you got a last thought?
Well, I would like to just address this whole thing of cozies being light and silly and very unreal, and
that's a whole
PI
topic.
novels being real and gritty.
Right. That's a topic for another time.
I would argue those.
Well,
another time.
You know what? We'll let you argue that.
Okay.
Now that we've got that all cleared up, we're going to take a short break, and then we'll be back with our guest. who tonight is author Monica Ferris.